Good morning. It's Tuesday, December 22nd, 2015. This is your morning edition on I-24 News. Coming up later today, Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah threatens to avenge the killing of the notorious operative Samir Quntar in Syria, blaming his death on Israel. Two of the soccer world's biggest executives have been banned for 8 years following an investigation into corruption in FIFA. And later on in the show, Tel Aviv's Showcase Documentary Film Festival moves out of the city and into Israel's wild south. Good morning, I'm Yael Wissner-Levy, and we begin here in the region this morning. Hezbollah chief Hassan Nasrallah has left no room to doubt who his organization blames for the killing of Hezbollah militant Samir Quntar earlier this week in Syria, laying the blame in a televised address squarely at Israel's feet. Nasrallah promised his organization would avenge the assassination, quote, in the time and place and manner of our choosing. Quntar, who was convicted of murdering an Israeli family in 1979 and was handed over to Hezbollah in a prisoner swap in 2008, was given a hero's funeral in Beirut with thousands of supporters accompanying his coffin to burial, chanting anti-Israel and anti-American slogans. And earlier yesterday, the Free Syrian Army rebel group took credit for the killing of Quntar in an online video. But both Hezbollah and Syrian regime-affiliated media outlets said they found remnants of Israeli missiles at the scene of the blast. We're joined now in studio by Dr. Benedetta Berti, a research fellow at the INSS and a lecturer on non-state organizations at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us. Thank you. And by Dr. Raj Steamed from the Alliance Center for Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University and the Forum for Regional Thinking. And thank you for joining us. And by I-24 News senior Middle East analyst Ali Waqid.
Good morning.
Let's all take a look at the next report, and we'll take it from there.
A funeral procession in Beirut's Dakhia quarter for a man who became a symbol of the Lebanese militant Hezbollah organization. The body of the terrorist Samir Quntar was brought back to Lebanon following his death in Damascus Saturday, in what Hezbollah officials are saying was an Israeli airstrike.
If the Israelis think that by killing Samir Quntar they have closed an account, then they are very mistaken. Because they know and will come to know that they have instead opened several more that can't be easily closed.
But while Israel has maintained a typical silence, others have in fact claimed credit.
The operational battalion of the Damascus Regional Command, together with the Knights of the Haran Brigade, conducted the assassination of Samir Quntar and his companions. And we deny the statement by Hezbollah that this was done by the Zionist Air Force. This was an attempt to make light of the Free Syrian Army's achievements.
It is far from certain that Syrian rebels were indeed responsible, but the claim is indicative of Hezbollah's complex situation. Its involvement in the Syrian civil war, in which according to Israeli estimates it is thought to have lost over 1,300 fighters, means the militant group has no shortage of enemies. Samir Quntar joined Hezbollah in 2008 after it managed to release him and others from Israeli imprisonment in exchange for the bodies of 2 dead IDF soldiers. In the past few months, Quntar had set up the Jaramana district of Damascus as his base, while he worked on organizing attacks against Israel on the Golan Heights. For this, he used his contacts with the Syrian Druze community, many of whom live near the border with Israel. While he was still perceived as a senior figure in Hezbollah, there are indications he had become increasingly independent, and that his bosses in Beirut and Tehran did not support his efforts to strike at Israel, as both Hezbollah and Iran currently have their hands full with other concerns. Hezbollah faces a major dilemma over what will constitute its response to the death of Quntar, with the organization's Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah scheduled to hold a speech Monday evening. 3 rockets were fired into Israeli territory Sunday, but Hezbollah has notably not claimed responsibility for those launches. Last January, the group fired an anti-tank missile at an IDF border patrol, killing 2 Israeli soldiers, in response to an Israeli strike in Syrian territory, which killed a high-ranking Hezbollah commander, as well as Iranian officers. Many are wondering how much Hezbollah is willing to gamble as it mulls a response to the latest developments.
We're going now to the Golan Heights on the Israeli-Syrian border. We're joined via Skype by Hamid Awidat, a reporter for Syrian State TV and Iran's Press TV. Thank you for joining us and good morning.
Good morning.
So, of course, this is definitely not the first time that tensions are rising on this border. Following Nasrallah's speech yesterday, would you say that tensions are rising even further?
You know, since the attack with Samir Quntar and killed him, you know, there's the IDF here. They just wake up again, and they know. I believe that they know exactly that Hezbollah will give them back this kind of fire that they put it in Damascus just 2 days ago. And if they go back to the history, the IDF and the Israeli government, also they know that Hezbollah is a kind of organization that they will not be quiet. And I believe who can read the eyes and who can read the words of the Hassan Nasrallah speech yesterday, he will know that the re-attack of Hezbollah on Israel will be soon in the next few days.
But what is the feeling among residents? Of course, that's an assessment, and we'll discuss it just in a moment here in studio as well about the probability of Hezbollah and the scope of a revenge attack. But among residents, what's the assessment right now regarding a revenge attack?
Sorry, I didn't hear you.
What's the assessment among residents? What's the feeling, sentiments among residents on the border right now?
You know, it's not the feeling. It's not the feeling. There's an attack or there's not an attack. You know, the settlements here. You know, they know that any step or any kind of fire on the border these days or the last few months, it's different than the war, or it's different the fights that they know, you know, because they know now here that it's very complicated, you know. It's not just the Syrian army or Hezbollah or the IDF that they are in the area. They know that it's full of fighters, you know, that there are a lot of nationalities, and all of them, they are following to different groups and leaders, you know, and no one can control them. And the most important thing that there is no United Nations also soldiers here in the area. So if there will be a war in the future or any kind of fight, it will be like open fire everywhere.
Khamed Awidat there on the Israeli-Syrian border. Thank you for joining us. Benedetta, does Hezbollah, and this is the question that probably many in the Israeli security establishment are asking this morning, do they have the capacity to go out with a full-scale confrontation with Israel when they're really embattled right now in Syria?
Well, I think that's not just what the Israeli security establishment is waiting for. I think this is also the assumption that would motivate any kind of operation, that has motivated any kind of Israeli operation against Hezbollah and transfers of weapons in the past 2 years. Namely, the assumption is Hezbollah is all in Syria. Hezbollah is fighting the Islamic State in the border region and on Lebanese soil as well. Hezbollah is busy, and therefore they should not, and they cannot afford to open a second front against Israel. That is the assumption that has guided, I would argue, most Israeli actions and calculations towards Hezbollah in the past couple of years. I think there is some reason to believe this is accurate. At the same time, Hezbollah is an organization that greatly invests on its reputation, on its resistance agenda. So there's only up until a certain point, Hezbollah will not retaliate. In other words, the organization has two interests: not starting a war and not showing itself as weak or uncommitted. So they will start to do something in the middle, as they have in the past couple of years.
And on that point, Ali, of course, we see exactly what Benedetta is saying in Nasrallah's speech. There was nothing new, nothing that surprised us in his rhetoric. At the same time, he had to make that speech in order to appease Hezbollah supporters.
Yeah, absolutely. And Yael, since the late 90s, Israeli analysts were analyzing the body gesture of Secretary General of Hezbollah, saying that he is weak, he is tired, etc. Of course, during all these years, he showed that he got only stronger than ever. But in this last speech, we could see the complexity of priorities, the complexity of decision that the organization had to make. It is true that Hezbollah prestige was built on the fact that every Israeli attack was retaliated, including the Imad Mughniye, because we are talking that also after Imad Mughniye assassination, he he was only threatening. But we do forget that in Latin America he tried and it did not succeed. In Africa he tried and it did not succeed. In Greece he tried and it did not succeed or slightly succeeded. I think this is the case of Hassan Nasrallah. He will not open a front, but yes, he will try to retaliate elsewhere. And in the last weeks, and even in the last month, especially in the last weeks, when the IDF is identifying that Palestinians in the West Bank are passing from the popular intifada to the firearms, it is due also to the investment of Hezbollah in cells in the West Bank to incite them, to encourage them to lead attacks against Israeli targets, and this can be part of Hezbollah reaction.
And we're talking about a front, and we do have to remember that this week only residents of Israel's north had to seek shelter. And I do want to go to get a sense of the people in the north and what they're going through in these past few days. Returning now to Sivan Yechiel, the head of the Kfar Vradim Local Council, and you're also the chairman of the Forum of Leaders of Communities on the confrontation line. Sivan, good morning.
Good morning.
So, of course, this week, residents of these communities had to seek shelter after sirens went off and 3 rockets entered into Israel.
Yes, 3 rockets entered into Israel in the Nahariya region by the coast, and there were sirens and people went into bomb shelters. But the immediate response from Tzahal was also heard, which also put people under pressure a bit. But on the other side, the Home Front Command immediately issued instructions that we're going back to routine and everything's going back to normal, and we should not take that more than it was. So that's what happened. What happened was one single event, and that's it.
And we are discussing here in studio that Hezbollah does retaliate systematically for attacks on its soil, on its people. Is the northern communities going to operate differently, even though this was a one-end attack, you say, in this week, but in the nearable future? Or are you asking the government to treat you differently, or the IDF?
Well, it's all in all, everything together is going to be different, because when we are preparing for the next confrontation, hopefully it will not come, but we have to be prepared for it. When we are preparing ourselves for it, we know that it's going to be very different from the 2006 event that we all experienced. And therefore, there is a dramatic change in the behaviors of the municipalities, or in the preparedness of the municipalities, and the preparedness of the army, and obviously the preparedness of the other readiness of the other bodies that are involved, such as the government officers. So, and I would like to add to what the former speakers said. Mm-hmm. The idea is not necessarily that they're going to retaliate and immediately a war is going to break. The idea is that, in a cynical way, we may say, God forbid someone hits a target, and then things can escalate. And when they escalate, we have to be prepared to what they have rather than to what they mean. So we don't mind if they only meant to frighten us. If at the end of the day they will be able to fire thousands of rockets in a very short period of time,
right.
And that's going to be something that we have to be ready for.
Sivan Yechiel, the head of the Kfar Vradim Local Council, thank you for joining us this morning. And Raz, we can't talk about Hezbollah without, of course, speaking of Iran. Any press in Iran or speakings of the last week, including Samir Quntar and the retaliation?
Well, we've seen the usual condemnations from Iran. The Iranian press is engaged in other stuff right now, the elections for the parliament. But I think that the most important thing is what's going on between the Revolutionary Guards, especially the Quds Force commander, Qasem Soleimani, who is apparently in Syria, and Hezbollah. I assume they're probably consulting right now to see if and when they are going to retaliate. I believe Iran has much better things to do than retaliate. They want to retaliate, but they are heavily engaged in Syria. We've seen that they're pulled back at least hundreds of Iranian fighters from Syria after the heavy casualties among the Revolutionary Guards in Syria. So they share Hezbollah interests not to open a new front against Israel.
And also, and you talk about their list of priorities, they're embattled in so many other conflicts. Can we see, the past few months of the West kind of giving Iran the seat at the table, also impacting their decision-making regarding Israel and Hezbollah, or is that a different story completely?
I think it's a different story. The driver of Iranian regional policy is the Revolutionary Guards. The driver of the nuclear issue is more Rouhani and his foreign minister. So it might affect in the future because Iran might have more capabilities to assist Syria, to assist Hezbollah, but right now it's they have other priorities.
And Benedetta, of course, in Samir Quntar's will, he left pretty much very direct directions. Can you give us an insight into what that will was about?
Well, let's just say that everything here is helping. If the organization, if Hezbollah at this point wanted to have some level of response to this attack without being dragged into an escalation, let's say the idea that Samir Quntar told Hezbollah not to fall into an Israeli trap by getting dragged into a war, more or less, that's the key message. Let's say that does just help. So everything goes back to the original message. The original message is Hezbollah does and agree each and every time they do say they retaliate. Their normal formula is the resistant will choose when and how. But the fact that there will be a reaction is part of what Hezbollah has always been doing. In this particular case, I think there is a need to show some immediate reaction, and that could be the fire of a couple of rockets, which doesn't really change the balance of power or cross any red lines. And in the more longer term, we may see Hezbollah trying to do something abroad. I think that would be the most reasonable approach if the organization wants to avoid an escalation, which I think they want.
Right. Ali?
I think, Yael, Samir Quntar was working on developing what the Syrian call the Popular Committee's resistance. This is something that the Syrians have been working on since the early 2000s, and Samir Quntar indeed was in relation with some pro-regime Druze that lives in the Israeli side of the Golan. Some of them are now in jail, got investigated by the Israeli Shin Bet. Also in the Syrian part of the Golan, he was building the infrastructure, and the question is whether this project will be maintained by the Syrian and by the Iranians, a project in which Hezbollah was not directly involved. It is true that Samir Quntar staff received the trainings and the experience of Hezbollah, but it was almost a parallel track to the track that Hezbollah was developing in the borders between Israel and Lebanon and in the Shaba region. It would be very interesting to follow whether there will be someone who will replace Samir Quntar in leading this very important project for the Syrians.
And in that case, Iran will be heavily invested in finding a replacement, if there is a replacement, but they are still dictating the shots from Tehran.
Iran is doing its best to gain a foothold in Golan Heights. They're using all kinds of proxies, either Palestinian organization or Quntar. So they'll probably try to continue to do that. But their main investment right now is in Syria, in the civil war in Syria, and they can't afford themselves to be too to put
Scattered,
more efforts,
right.
to scatter it.
Well, thank you all for joining me this morning, Dr. Benedetta Berti and Dr. Raz Tzimt. Thank you, and Ali, thank you for joining us. We have more after this.